The midday sun beat down on the cracked asphalt of Chicago's South Side, shimmering off the chrome bumper of Jack's taxi. He squinted, adjusting his rearview mirror, and sighed. It had been a long, slow morning, the kind where fares were scarce, and the only company was the drone of the radio and the gnawing emptiness in his wallet. Jack wasn't a bad man, not truly. He was a product of his environment, shaped by the subtle prejudices and casual racism that seeped into the very air he breathed. He'd grown up hearing certain words, seeing certain looks, and absorbing the unspoken assumptions that divided his city. He wasn't a card-carrying racist, but he carried within him the ingrained biases that society had carefully cultivated. A hand rapped against the passenger window, startling him. He turned to see a tall, broad-shouldered black man standing on the curb, a suitcase at his feet. "You available?" the man asked, his voice deep and resonant. "Yeah, hop in," Jack mumbled, popping the trunk. He watched as the man heaved his suitcase inside, the muscles in his arms flexing beneath the short sleeves of his t-shirt. As the man settled into the back seat, Jack glanced at him in the mirror. He was dressed casually, but there was an air of quiet dignity about him. Something about the man's demeanor made Jack uneasy. "Where to?" he asked, pulling away from the curb. "O'Hare," the man replied. O'Hare. A long ride and a potentially good fare. Jack usually enjoyed the airport runs. They were reliable and paid well. But today, a knot of unease tightened in his stomach. He couldn't explain it. It was just a feeling, a prickle of discomfort that he couldn't shake. The first few miles passed in silence. Jack fiddled with the radio, scanning through the static-laced stations. He glanced in the mirror again. The man was looking out the window, his face impassive. Jack cleared his throat. "Heading out of town?" he asked, making an attempt at conversation. "Yeah," the man replied, his voice clipped. "Business trip?" "Something like that." The conversation stalled again. Jack felt a surge of irritation. He was trying to be friendly, trying to break the awkward silence, and the man was giving him nothing. He told himself it wasn't personal, that some people just weren't talkative. But the little voice in the back of his head whispered something else, something ugly and insidious. As they drove, the city gave way to the sprawling suburbs, the landscape shifting from concrete and steel to manicured lawns and strip malls. The sun beat down mercilessly, turning the inside of the taxi into a sweltering oven. Jack's discomfort grew, fueled by the heat, the silence, and the nagging voice in his head. Then it happened. A news report came on the radio detailing a recent incident of police brutality against a black man in another city. The details were sketchy, the facts unclear, but the underlying narrative was familiar. Another black man dead at the hands of law enforcement. Jack listened, his jaw tightening. He wasn't a racist, he told himself, but he believed in law and order. He believed in respecting authority. And lately, it seemed like every time he turned on the news, there was another story about a black man resisting arrest, causing trouble, playing the victim. He glanced in the mirror. The man was listening to the report, his expression unreadable. "These guys," Jack muttered, more to himself than to the passenger. "They never learn. They always gotta resist." The man in the back seat stiffened. "Resist what?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Jack hesitated. He knew he was treading on thin ice, but the words were already out there, hanging in the air between them. The heat, the silence, the news report, the ingrained biases. It was all bubbling to the surface, pushing him towards a confrontation he didn't want, but couldn't seem to avoid. "Resist authority," he stammered. "The cops are just trying to do their job." "Their job?" the man repeated, his voice laced with sarcasm. "You call that doing their job? Well, they wouldn't have to use force if—" Jack trailed off, realizing how his words sounded. He knew he was digging himself deeper into a hole, but he couldn't stop. The years of absorbing the subtle poison of prejudice were finally finding their voice. "If what?" the man challenged. Jack took a deep breath, his hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. "If they would just comply," he said, the words laced with anger and frustration. "If they would just listen to the cops, follow the rules, then none of this would happen." The man in the back seat was silent for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and controlled, but filled with an intensity that made Jack's blood run cold. You don't understand, he said. You don't have a clue. Oh, I understand perfectly, Jack retorted, his voice rising. I see it on the news every day. It's always the same story. You see what they want you to see, the man said. You see the narrative they've created. You don't see the reality. And what's the reality? Jack sneered. The reality, the man said, is that we're tired. We're tired of being judged by the color of our skin. We're tired of being profiled, harassed, and killed. We're tired of the excuses, the justifications, the lies. Look, Jack said, his voice shaking slightly. I'm not a racist. I'm just saying. You're just saying what you've been told to say, the man interrupted. You're just repeating the same tired stereotypes, the same old prejudices. Jack's anger flared. He felt cornered, attacked. He wasn't a bad person, he told himself. He was just expressing his opinion. But deep down, a flicker of doubt began to gnaw at him. You think you know everything, he snapped. You think you're so enlightened. But you don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through. And you don't know anything about me, the man replied. You don't know what I've seen, what I've experienced. Well, maybe you should try following the rules for once, Jack said, the words tumbling out before he could stop them. The man in the back seat was silent. Then he let out a low, humorless laugh. Follow the rules, he repeated. Whose rules? Jack didn't answer. He knew what the man meant. He knew the unspoken rules that governed their society, the rules that were written in invisible ink, the rules that were based on race and power. They drove in silence for several minutes, the tension in the car thick and suffocating. Jack's anger began to subside, replaced by a growing sense of unease. He glanced in the mirror again. The man was staring out the window, his face etched with sadness and resignation. Then Jack did something he immediately regretted. He opened his mouth and spoke, the words laced with the venom of his accumulated prejudices. You people, he said, the phrase dripping with contempt. You're always complaining. You're always playing the victim. You need to stop blaming everyone else for your problems and take some responsibility for your own lives. The man in the back seat turned his head slowly and looked directly at Jack. His eyes were filled with a pain that seemed to reach across the divide between them, a pain that resonated deep within, a pain that resonated deep within Jack's own soul, a place he rarely visited. For a moment, the anger, the prejudice, the years of ingrained bias seemed to melt away, replaced by a flicker of understanding, a glimpse into the other side of the divide. But the moment passed quickly, the familiar defenses snapping back into place. Jack's discomfort returned, amplified by the shame of his own words. He knew he had crossed a line that should never be crossed. He had unleashed the ugliness that lurked within him, the ugliness that society had nurtured and allowed to fester. The man's gaze held him captive. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes conveyed a universe of unspoken words, a history of suffering, a lifetime of injustice. Jack looked away, unable to meet his gaze any longer. They continued the drive in silence, the air thick with unspoken emotions. Jack's mind raced, replaying the conversation, dissecting his own words. He tried to justify them, tried to convince himself that he hadn't said anything wrong, that he was just expressing his opinion. But the voice in the back of his head, the voice of his conscience, whispered a different truth. He glanced in the mirror again. The man was still staring out the window, his profile silhouetted against the passing landscape. Jack couldn't see his expression, but he could feel the weight of his gaze, the weight of his unspoken words. As they approached O'Hare, Jack's anxiety grew. He knew he had to say something, had to apologize, had to try to repair the damage he had done. But the words wouldn't come. He was trapped by his own prejudice, trapped by the fear of admitting his mistake. They arrived at the airport, and Jack pulled up to the designated taxi stand. The man got out of the car, retrieved his suitcase from the trunk, and turned to face Jack. "Thank you," he said, his voice flat, devoid of any emotion. Jack mumbled a response, avoiding his gaze. He watched as the man walked away, disappearing into the crowd of travelers. He wanted to call after him, wanted to apologize, wanted to explain, but the words remained trapped in his throat. He watched the man disappear into the terminal, the weight of his own actions pressing down on him like a physical burden. He felt a wave of nausea, a wave of self-loathing. He had behaved in a way that was completely contrary to his own self-image. He wasn't a racist, he told himself again. He was just angry, frustrated, misunderstood. But the excuses rang hollow, even to his own ears. He knew he had to confront the truth about himself, the truth about the prejudices that he had carried for so long. He sat in his taxi, the engine idling, the silence broken only by the distant hum of the airport. He thought about the man, about the pain he had seen in his eyes. He thought about the news report he had heard on the radio, about the countless other stories of injustice and discrimination. He thought about his own life, about his own experiences. He had grown up in a working-class neighborhood, surrounded by poverty and violence. He had seen firsthand the effects of inequality, the way that race could determine a person's opportunities, their chances in life. He had always prided himself on being a fair man, on treating everyone with respect. But today he had failed. He had allowed his prejudices to control him, to dictate his actions. He knew he couldn't change the past. He couldn't undo the words he had spoken. But he could change the future. He could choose to confront his own biases, to challenge the prejudices that lurked within him. He could choose to listen, to learn, to understand. He started the engine and pulled away from the curb, heading back toward the city. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. As he drove, he thought about the man, about the pain in his eyes. He knew he would never forget him. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Jack went through the motions, picking up fares, dropping off passengers, but his mind was elsewhere. He was replaying the encounter over and over, analyzing his own words, trying to understand why he had said them. He realized that it wasn't just about the news report, or the heat, or the silence. It was about something deeper, something more ingrained. It was about the subtle messages he had received throughout his life, the implicit biases that had shaped his worldview. He thought about his own family, about his own children. He thought about the kind of world he wanted them to grow up in, a world where everyone was treated with respect, regardless of their race or background. A world where justice and equality were not just empty words, but a lived reality. He knew that changing the world started with changing himself. He knew that it wouldn't be easy. It would require a conscious effort, a willingness to confront his own prejudices, to challenge his own assumptions. He drove late into the night, his thoughts swirling around him. He picked up a few more fares, but his heart wasn't in it. He was distracted, preoccupied by the events of the day. Finally, he decided to call it a night. He drove back to his apartment, a small, cramped space in a rundown building. He parked his taxi in the street and walked up the dimly lit stairs to his apartment. He unlocked the door and stepped inside, the silence of the apartment a stark contrast to the noise and bustle of the city. He closed the door behind him and leaned against it, letting out a long sigh. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He walked into the living room and sank into the worn-out armchair, staring at the blank television screen. He didn't turn it on. He wasn't in the mood for distractions. He closed his eyes and thought about the man again, about the pain in his eyes. He knew he had a long way to go, a lot to learn, but he also knew that he had to start somewhere. He opened his eyes and looked around the room, at the familiar objects that surrounded him. He saw his reflection in the darkened window, a tired, weary face. He knew that the man he saw in the reflection was not the man he wanted to be. He stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the city lights twinkling in the distance. He thought about the future, about the kind of person he wanted to be. He knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. It would take time, effort, and a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths about himself. He thought about the man again, about the words he had spoken, about the pain he had caused. He knew he couldn't undo the past, but he could learn from it. He could use it as a catalyst for change. He made a silent promise to himself, a promise to be better, to do better. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he also knew it was the right thing to do. He turned away from the window and walked into the bedroom. He undressed and got into bed, pulling the covers up around him. He closed his eyes, but sleep didn't come easily. His mind was still racing, replaying the events of the day, analyzing his own words, contemplating the future. He lay in the darkness, his thoughts swirling around him, until finally exhaustion overtook him and he drifted off to sleep. But even in his dreams, the pain in the man's eyes lingered, a constant reminder of the journey he had just begun. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he had to try. He had to try to be a better man. He had to try to make amends. He had to try to bridge the divide. But how? The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, as he drifted into an uneasy slumber. The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered, as he drifted into an uneasy slumber. He dreamt of fractured reflections, of faces shifting and merging, of voices echoing with accusation and forgiveness. He woke with a start, the remnants of the dream clinging to him like a damp shroud. The first rays of dawn were creeping through the blinds, painting the room in a pale gray light. He lay in bed for a long moment, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. He knew he couldn't just let it go, couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. He had to do something. He got out of bed, the cold floor sending a shiver through him. He went to the bathroom, splashed some water on his face, and looked at his reflection in the mirror. The face that stared back at him seemed older, more weary than it had been yesterday. He saw the lines of worry etched around his eyes, the subtle sag of his jaw. He saw the man who had spoken those hateful words, the man he didn't want to be. He went to the kitchen and made a pot of coffee, the aroma filling the small apartment. As he waited for the coffee to brew, he thought about what he could do. He knew an apology wasn't enough. It wouldn't erase the pain he had caused, the damage he had done. He needed to do more than just say sorry. He needed to demonstrate a genuine change in his attitude, a commitment to understanding and empathy. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring out the window at the awakening city. He thought about the man again, about his quiet dignity, his profound sadness. He thought about the countless other men and women who had experienced similar acts of prejudice, similar acts of hate. He knew he couldn't change the world, couldn't single-handedly eradicate racism, but he could change himself. He could choose to be part of the solution, not part of the problem. He could choose to listen, to learn, to grow. He finished his coffee and went back to the bathroom. He looked at his reflection again, this time seeing not just the lines of worry, but also a flicker of resolve. He knew what he had to do. He went to his closet and pulled out a clean shirt. He dressed quickly, eager to get started. He grabbed his keys and his wallet and headed out the door, leaving the apartment behind him. He drove to O'Hare, the familiar route taking on a new significance. He parked his taxi in the same spot where he had dropped off the man the day before. He got out of the car and walked into the terminal, the bustling crowd seeming less chaotic than usual. He scanned the faces around him, searching for a familiar one. He didn't see him. He walked over to the information desk and asked if there was a way to locate a passenger from a previous day. The attendant explained that due to privacy regulations, they couldn't release passenger information. Jack understood, but he was still disappointed. He walked around the terminal, his eyes constantly searching the crowd. He imagined the man's face, his quiet demeanor. He imagined the pain he had caused. He spent several hours at the airport, walking back and forth, hoping to catch a glimpse of the man. But he didn't see him. As the day wore on, his hope began to dwindle. He started to wonder if he would ever have the chance to make amends. He decided to leave the airport. He walked back to his taxi, feeling defeated. He got in the car and sat for a moment, staring at the steering wheel. He didn't know what else to do. Then he had an idea. He started the engine and drove to a local community center, a place that served the predominantly black neighborhood where he had grown up. He parked the taxi and went inside. He asked to speak to the director, explaining that he wanted to volunteer his time. The director, a kind, middle-aged black woman, listened to his story with interest. She asked him why he wanted to volunteer, what had motivated him. Jack hesitated for a moment, then told her about his encounter with the man at the airport, about the words he had spoken, about the pain he had seen in his eyes. The director nodded slowly, understanding. She told him that they always welcome volunteers, that they needed people who were willing to help. She gave him a list of tasks he could do, from tutoring children to helping with administrative work. Jack chose to tutor children. He had always been good with kids, and he thought it would be a good way to connect with the community, to learn from them, to understand their experiences. He started volunteering the following week. He worked with a group of young children, helping them with their reading and writing. He listened to their stories, their dreams, their fears. He learned about their lives, their struggles, their resilience. He continued to volunteer at the community center for several months. He built relationships with the children, their families, and the other volunteers. He learned a lot about the community, about the challenges they faced, about the strength they possessed. He never saw the man from the airport again. He didn't know if he ever would, but he continued to volunteer, driven by a desire to make amends, to atone for his past mistakes. He knew he couldn't change the past, but he could shape the future. He could choose to be a force for good, a voice for understanding, a bridge across the divide. He could choose to listen, to learn, to grow. He didn't know what the future held, but he knew he was on the right path. He knew he was finally facing his own prejudices, confronting his own demons. He knew he was changing, slowly but surely, becoming a better man. But the journey was far from over. The weight of his words, the memory of the pain in the man's eyes would stay with him, a constant reminder of the work that still needed to be done. He didn't know if he would ever find peace, ever truly forgive himself. The ending of his story, like the future itself, remained unwritten.